Your Honor, the President in this case has taken a military action within the sovereign territorial borders of a foreign country. That, in our estimation, is the very essence of an offensive nature. Under international law, a military action that is violative of the international borders of a foreign country is an act of war. That is indeed a cornerstone of international law, is that international borders are inviolate, and that a violation of territorial borders is an act of war. That's precisely what's happened in this case. The President has ordered the United States military to conduct a military operation within the borders of another country.
What would a defensive act look like in cybercrime?
Your Honor, it's Sherlock's understanding that the defensive cyber capabilities of the United States are committed to the National Security Agency as well as the Department of Homeland Security. And in that sense, both of those agencies have constructed a vast mechanism for defending the critical infrastructure of the United States against cyber operations conducted by other nations attacking our critical infrastructure. That would certainly be an example of a defensive cyber operation, and there's an extensive national security framework for allocating those resources to the departments that I just mentioned for defending critical infrastructure of the United States from foreign cyber attacks. In testimony before Congress, the commanding general of both Cybercom and the head of the NSA noted that there is a clear distinction between the two, however, that Cybercom would be primarily responsible for offensive operations in cyberspace, and that the other agencies mentioned, the NSA and the DHS, would be responsible for defensive actions. The facts of this case, the cyber operation conducted in this case, was conducted by Cyber Command, the branch of government responsible for offensive operations in cyberspace. And so I think that clearly answers the question as to whether or not this was an offensive.
So what was the purpose behind actually initiating these operations, the DOS and SCADA attack?
Ostensibly, it's our understanding the President's overall purpose was to shut down a method through which terrorists were communicating with each other and coordinating their attacks on the United States.
Does that not, do you have some defensive implications as well for the security of this country?
Tangentially, or in an approximate sense, Sherlock would submit that might be the case. But in order to get there, you have to, in essence, go through 3 or 4 steps. You have to look necessary in this case. As mentioned, it's been a year